Okay, so welcome back everyone to what will hopefully be another exciting, busy session looking specifically at artificial intelligence in health. We know that this is one of the most transformative technologies of our time. It could create unprecedented opportunities for health systems and how healthcare is delivered. But it's actually already being used, isn't it? It's being used to automate and streamline administrative activities. It's also being used to help with diagnosis and treatment. AI algorithms can analyze vast amounts of medical data and identify patterns, predict outcomes, improve patient-centered diagnostic accuracy. It can help doctors tailor treatments to individual patients based on factors like laboratory and imaging testing, genetics, lifestyle, and medical history. It can increase productivity and the efficiency of care delivery and allow healthcare systems to provide more and better care to people. But, of course, there are risks that come with all this as well. There is a great deal of potential here, but it's also raising some interesting questions about the future of medicine. Can AI advance the interests of patients and communities without a collective effort to design and implement the right laws and policies and ethically designed AI technologies? How grave are the consequences if ethical principles and human rights obligations are not prioritized by those who fund, design, regulate, or use AI technologies for health? And how do we overcome obstacles like poor quality and fragmentation of health data needed to train AI algorithms, a lack of governance, standards, and regulation, issues which all stand in the way of scaling AI in healthcare? So we have a fantastic panel of experts that are going to get into all of these issues and much more. It's going to be moderated by Alain Labrique, so he will be joining us a bit later. First, so I want to welcome Bart de Witte to the stage, who's going to provide us with really more food for thought and more inspiration. Bart is an award-winning expert in digital healthcare. He's the founder of the Hippo AI Foundation, which is based in Berlin and has extensive experience in the field of technology and innovation in healthcare. He advises governments and organizations on this issue with a particular focus on the socio-economic impact on healthcare. So Bart, if you can just come up and join us. And I know, Bart, that your work has been recognized with prestigious German AI awards, and the initial project focusing on something very important, your initial project focusing on breast cancer, is one of the top 100 global projects solving problems related to the 17 UN SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals, with the application of AI. So congratulations on your work, and I'm sure there will be many more exciting initiatives to come from the Hippo AI Foundation.
Hello. Yeah. Good morning. I feel extremely privileged to be here and to share my views. I have 3 goals today. I want to show you what openness does and how we can accelerate innovation, which is inclusive. I want to break with a lot of the dogmas around open source AI. And at the end, I want to explain you what our concept of regenerative AI is. And I was asked to as well bring some policy advice. The Hippo AI Foundation is a community-based foundation, so we are going bottom-up. We are uniting people globally, and we do this together with patients, humans, and we believe that we together as a community need to unite the data, and we build in a very open and transparent way because we, as a goal, have the goal of reducing the information asymmetries. When I talk about AI today, I'm not going to differentiate. I know there is a lot of differentiation needed, but for the simplicity of this lecture, I will stay with and stick with AI. During the last 4 years, I've been on a journey. I worked for 20 years of my life in big tech. I was at IBM, and I started to look into sociology and philosophy to start to understand what is it what we're actually doing when we digitize. And one of the people that inspired me is a social theorist from the LMU in Munich, Armin Nasehi, and he wrote his theory of digitalization, and in that theory he wrote that digitalization is nothing else as the duplication of the world through data. It sounds very simple, but that's what we have been doing. When we predict the weather, we collect data, we start to duplicate weather systems, and we apply machine learning to predict the weather. When this virus came to our life, we started to collect data, and in order to simulate, so we can start looking at therapies, that how they react on these simulations. And we have been doing this since a while, but as we have more compute power, more data, these simulations get really very complex. This is, for example, images from an MRI that has been put together into a 3D model, so the surgeon prior to surgery can use this. This is also machine learning. It's not so visible, but it's already applied within the healthcare setting. And another duplication of the world through data is when we, or when a team from DeepMind published the whole human proteome, like all proteins as a duplication, into an open source database and made it available for researchers. Or in this case, it was Baker Lab predicting protein boundings on molecules so we can start predicting drugs. So these machine learning models starting to have impact. But one thing that started to worry me, if we look at the duplication through the world, that a lot of these duplications are going from one sphere to the other. It's moving and shifting from what I call the public sphere to the private sphere. And it goes mostly into one direction, and it creates asymmetries. And I started to ask myself, when we duplicate our world through data, what kind of a duplication do we then actually need? Because I've worked for IBM, and I've been working in global healthcare systems in Eastern Europe, in the US and Europe, and you start to see differences between these systems because we don't all share the same norms and rights and principles when it comes to serving a population. And technology is not neutral, so technology can be embedded with these norms, and in that case, if we start then applying the business models of Silicon Valley, what does that mean when we duplicate that model in our European healthcare systems? So are we heading to a future problem? And I'm a sci-fi fan, and I watched this science fiction series on Netflix, which is 250 years in the future, called Altered Carbon. Now, you're going to ask me why am I showing this, but it kind of gives you an idea on the values. Like this is a world where everything is being democratized. You can unplug your consciousness, put it into other bodies, and you can fly around with cars. And there was this hospital scene where the protagonist of the series brings his wife to the emergency care, and then he needs to identify, put her hand on the counter to identify her, and then she's declined because she didn't have enough credits. When I watched this later, I said like, whoa, but the surgery is only performed by robots. You can fly a car, but you don't get access to healthcare. How does that work? But, well, perhaps if you keep on continuing building technology on a system and your values and your norms, that is a realistic scenario. And that means realistic because we are starting to do what we're starting to do in digitalization, is we're starting to assetize data and machine learning models. The assetization of data is a non-tangible assetization because it's not something physical, like a house where I live in Berlin. You can have houses on the market. These are tangible assets, but knowledge is untangible or non-tangible. And so what we do is we take health data, we take machine learning models, and we encapsulate it in a trained or pre-trained model, and then we protect it with so-called trade secrets, and sometimes you can also apply patents on it, and then it becomes an asset. How this works is different as commodities, because people think that data is a commodity. No, data is becoming an asset. Commodities are very different as an asset in itself, because the commodity is the value derived by exchange, and with the assets is the value that is projected on the future value of that asset. And how this works, you could see with Flatiron, which is a startup that was collecting oncology data sets. They gave the oncology record through a cloud service for free. 2 million patient records were collected. And then there was an exit to a Swiss pharmaceutical company for a few $billion, just 4 years after the company was founded. The value here is an assetization and then being shifted through a single company. So this is what we see happening on the market. Like startups are a solution, but if startups are consolidating through the financial markets, we will perhaps already pay the price for some future value that is created. The difference as well with assets is that the prices increases when the demand goes up. And that is something that we know and is very familiar. And what we witnessed in the US, the price of insulin went up by 1,200% in the last 2 decades. How is that possible, people ask? Well, because insulin was an asset. And the financial markets drove then the profit so high, so you get these prices up. And in the scientific world, we know that as well. Because scientific publishing started with the idea that we pay for a PDF on the internet, and then suddenly a lot of people can't even get access to research anymore when you look at it from a global level. Because we are turning publicly funded, tax-funded research into an asset that belongs to a few single companies that are more profitable as big tech companies nowadays. So assetization is all around us. But I started to ask the question, do we really need to repeat it when it comes to data? And I saw that the driver mostly came out of financial markets, so we created a concept what we call regenerative AI, which is coming from the regenerative economy. Coming back to that Armin Azé theory of digitalization, that the digitalization is nothing else as a duplication to the world to data, I started to look into Jürgen Habermas' philosophy. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Jürgen Habermas. He 60 years ago started to talk about a structural change of communication that was shifting from the public sphere to the private sphere. And he predicted actually the discussions that we are having today, that suddenly when you have communication that is on a platform, then suddenly these terms and conditions of these platforms will start to define which communications we can have. So that means that there is a shift in norms and there is a transgression from norms and values from one sphere to the other. And seeing that model, I started to recognize that most probably in healthcare we will see the same. If we start shifting data from that public sphere to the private sphere into only one direction, as it's also described in the European health data space, because there is a sentence in there that private companies can create IP, then we will shift value to that private sphere. And I think that's problematic because it's going to build new asymmetries that will perhaps lead in the future to the scenario we have seen that robot surgery is not so accessible. And I come from technology, and technology has been fascinating because it's following Moore's law. It becomes cheaper. Everybody has a phone in their pocket that has the compute power of a crazy supercomputer of the 80s. Now, that's fascinating, but if you start to putting a price on data, as you see here, and the price goes up, we won't see the effects. And we have been talking in healthcare about Elon's law, not Moore's law, because the effects of technology have not even touched. And if data accumulations follow capital concentrations, then these data accumulations might not be here in Europe. So that means that if we start to make things scarce, that the promise of digital health might not happen, but I think there is a solution for that because we don't have to make them scarce. So because we need to go in that sustainability index. Everybody knows the SDGs here, I assume. 4 years or 5 years ago, I was at an AI for Good conference, and there was a company from Silicon Valley demonstrating how they were using their AI systems to detect diabetic retinopathy. And they were selling this as an SDG 3 project. So I asked the question, was the AI model open? Was the data shared? And was it contributed? And of course, nothing of it was shared. So I called it data colonialism, and I got really some angry people looking at me because the company was the main sponsor of the event. And I think we need to ask these questions because you cannot look at these SDGs as being not interconnected. You cannot go to India and saying, whoa, we're going to serve you with healthcare. I come from Belgium. Well, that's something our grandparents did perhaps 200 years ago. That is not sustainable. We need to think different when it comes to global health because these SDGs are all interconnected. That means that we should not only work on literacy, as was described before, but we should also let people to learn how to write their own digital stories. And then we need access to an alphabet to write it. So regenerative AI is a concept that is embracing the principles of open source collaboration and transparency, and it's opposed to extractive AI. So what we have been seeing in the market today is that these systems of like OpenAI, we come later to that, are very extractive. Like they take data commons, they take everything what is public, and then they close everything, and with each transaction they learn. So with regenerative AI, we want to keep a balance. We want to create as much social value out of the data as economical value, because I'm not against economical value, but I'm against asymmetries in that sense. And if you oppose these two concepts, we are working on the principles. The principles will be able or allow us to define and rate these models. So what we are planning is next year to start creating an index of all these systems so we can rate these models and connect it to the ESG scores. The ESG scores are the ecological social governance models that need to be adopted in Europe by 2025. So every company needs to publish their social governance results. And there is no way to measure this at the moment, but we are working on this so we can measure these systems and can start creating incentives on the financial markets in order to create more balance and less asymmetries. We are working with a group of 75 researchers on this. If anybody wants to join, we are doing this as an open source project, and we'll launch this by the end of the year. So we stand in front of the choice. Are we going to darkness, or are we going to enlighten ourselves? And I think we're standing in front of the same decision perhaps as before we had started the Renaissance, or when Gutenberg invented the printing machine. And I'm going to show you how this works, because the path to darkness is something that we saw when OpenAI, the company that calls themselves open, has nothing to do with openness, published GPT-4 as a paper, where they actually showed that they took everything what they could get, but didn't even disclose which data they took. So you get a lot of people upset. And then Sam Altman was in Munich a few months ago and said following.
How many of you would like us to open source GPT-6 the day we finish?
Louder.
Wow. Well, we're not going to do that.
So he asked the audience, how many would like us to open source? Everybody raised their hands, and he said, you're not going to do that. So you get a lot of enemies doing this. And then the third thing is that they announced that they were asking the people for democratic inputs. But it sounded more like a feudal lord that was asking for democratic inputs, and you get a lot of people angry. And what actually happened after that, and that is so fascinating, the whole transformer language models was based on one single paper that was published even as open access paper by Google. And you started to see these large language models being in the private sector developed. And for a long time, until 2022, most of the developments were within the private sector, as you can see on the lower line. The top line is the open source, the middle one is open source for research. And since last year, what we have been witnessing is an explosion of open source large language models, which at the moment start to overperform on these closed models. So we're starting to see a revolution because we had a shared enemy in that sense. The first one was from big science, big tech, big science, which was a collaboration. Bloom, a research paper with 1,000 researchers collaborating to create a 175 billion parameter model. Open source is cheaper because when Bloom got published in August, a month later, OpenAI had to reduce their prices by 1/3 because they had competition with something that was way cheaper. There was as well a paper from Stanford that looked at Bloom and compared it with all the other commercial models. And the Bloom model aligned much better with the European AI Act because of the transparency they had. So it really works, this open source, strange sort of development. And then we saw, and that's the most fascinating thing, an explosion of the community. And if you see at the lower level, you don't need to understand what it is, but it's an open source large language model. Within 1 month, 2.5 million people downloaded the code of the model. That is not an application, that's downloading code. 2.5 million. Imagine what we can do when we do this globally in healthcare. Because then you start seeing cross-pollination, people starting to mix things together, and suddenly you see then that these models overperform GPT-4 in just a few weeks' time. So open source is eating closed source. AlphaFold, that everybody knows, is now being competed by OpenFold, which runs on one single CPU on your laptop. That means that a researcher in Africa can use it as well without having too much cost. And then there are these misconceptions that say like, well, you need these large infrastructure. No, the innovation cycles were so crazy that you now can run it on your phone. So I always make this joke that large language models will end up in my toaster at home, and I will be able to talk to my toaster without being connected to the cloud. There was also the misconception of bad actors. And there was a group of Dutch researchers recently that published their TETRA systems, which is a system that is in all emergency care military communication systems. For 20 years had a backdoor programmed in the encryption algorithm. Now, closed source is as prone to bad actors as open source. That backdoor was in there for 20 years and nobody saw it because it was closed source. So what do the European healthcare experts say? Jan de Kuhn, we all know him, works for Meta. He's from France. He's a godfather of...
Sadly, in the industry, there are people who are lobbying governments to actually make the open sourcing of large-scale LLM illegal. I'm very much in favor of a future with open-based models.
So I'm going to skip him because I want to go to my... Everybody who works in this field is telling that we should not create regulations and policies that are regulating open source. In the AI Act, a few lobbyists managed to put an amendment in there that coders who share their code should become liable for sharing their code. If that happens, we shoot in our own leg and we kill the whole open ecosystem in Europe. So with that, dear policymakers, look at this, because we all learned from this. During COVID, openness was the driver for innovation. And we have seen the rubber band effect, because 1 year after the pandemic was dissolved, we all went back to our old norms. We don't open anymore. Everything is closed again. So when we define policies, I think we need to work on the framework for regenerative AI. I can't read it, unfortunately. It's so small for me. But we have to work on the open source regenerative models. But also we need, and there is a huge missing thing, what we need is data licensing. A lot of people can oppose me on this, but there are so many discussions at the moment that what do we do with copyrights and AI? A lot of these AI companies are being sued because they are patenting or protecting these models while they take public or open source licensed goods. So what we need, in my sense, and what we discussed with experts, is a so-called share-alike license or copyleft license for patient data. Because if you start doing that, there is an obligation when you use that data that the AI model you use on that data needs to be open, and the output of that model needs to be open. And then we're going to bloom, we're going to create a truly open ecosystem, and that's something that we as an Hippo AI Foundation cannot change, but that's something policymakers can change. And if you do this in Europe, we can even put it into standards and create an open, more faster, innovative future that is inclusive and where these digital goods that we produce are available in the libraries for any innovator in the world to build local solutions that serve the local community. So with that said, I thank you for your attention and hope we have some discussions. By the way, I'm in Berlin. We don't like walls, so let's not build any wall that further leads to inequalities of health. Thank you so much.
Bart. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're about to have... Oh, wait, Bart, before you go away, while we still have you here, let me ask you, and just as our next panel gets ready to be seated, let me ask you about this. We speak about AI and the unprecedented growth of this technology, and you really gave a beautiful presentation about many of the issues involved and what the future could look like. But I'm just wondering, what is the best way to think about something that just feels so broad and so vast? What should we be focusing on? Because there are many different technologies at play. And I mean, I think for myself, I think of AI in two broad categories: perceptual AI, which replicates the ability of the medical professionals to perceive disease, like diagnosis and monitoring, and then intervention AI that might look at decisions in terms of how patients are treated. Just encapsulate how AI shows up in healthcare, what we mean by that.
Well, in every single, for patient support, patient empowerment, for supporting, augmenting physician and decisions, and for drug development, AI is everywhere embedded. But I think if there's one thing we need to really take into account is that we can do this all together. There is no need, and that was the goal of my presentation, there is no need to close AI. There is this dogma that you need innovations, need patents to drive innovations and investments. That is not true. You have seen this all in my presentation. People have a drive to collaborate. And OpenAI, when they published GPT-4, they had less than 500 employees. We have in Europe 14,700 AI researchers not working together. I think we can work on alignments, we can work on collaboration, and I think we need to do this on a global scale.
Why is this not already happening? Why are we not seeing more? I mean, I suppose there are innovation clusters from what you describe, but there's not enough intersectoral collaboration. Is that what you mean?
Well, I sometimes compare healthcare with Game of Thrones, so it's full of kingdoms and full of lords, and I'm trying to implement a democracy, which is always coming from bottom up. But I think there is, why it's not happening is that the incentives, especially in the research community, are not based or designed for collaboration. Like as a researcher, I want to publish my paper that is cited the most. The whole research publication community or incentives are based on ego, not on collaboration, on competition, on closeness. And I think that we can change this, but we need to all work together on this. Ask any researcher if he wants to collaborate on a research paper where 1,000 researchers are listed on a paper. Quite a lot don't want to even contribute.
So what you're saying is that we would achieve more progress if we took ego out of it?
I think we need a vision that we can work together on and define, like with the community that are displayed on the large language model is driven by the image of Sam Altman that is calling himself open and is closed. You get a lot of enemies doing that. So we need to choose our enemy, and for me this is inequalities. And I think if you pronounce this, why we are digitalizing and what is our ultimate goal, while we are at the same time assetizing, that doesn't work together. So you need to start defining how do you get to that goal and what are the principles you need to go in that direction.
And just one final question, can I ask how you did it? The difficult environment to navigate. So how has it been frustrating for you at times? How have you overcome obstacles? Yeah, it's been really frustrating.
Oh,
it's been really
you're fighting.
No, but
you're fighting against.
When you speak about just the landscape being very difficult and there not being a lot of collaboration and the incentives are not necessarily there, how have you navigated all of this to get your initiatives off the ground?
I learned a lot. Like, I think what you need is to try and error and learn through that and always readjust what you are doing. And that's what I've been doing in the last 4 years. And then I have a lot of confidence because I've seen this happening. I come from software. 30 years ago, software was not democratized. There was no way to get access to code. You had to go to Unix or my former employer IBM to learn how to code. Now there are 100 million users on a GitHub, which is a platform for coding. So because we democratized it. So I missed a bit like when we said we need digital literacy. Yes, we need people that read books, but we also need people that write the books. And in order to write, you need to get access to the alphabet. But if we start to turn the alphabet into assets which are protected by patents, nobody's going to write books. Like if Gutenberg would have patented the printed alphabet, we probably would have been buying still letter of indulgences to the Vatican. And I think we need to learn out of history what was the driver for progress. And I think it was always openness and collaboration. Even if you go to the Baghdad in 700 past Christus, the House of Wisdom, the translation movement, during that time there was openness was the driver, collaboration. And I think we are open in Europe. We just need the leadership to drive us in that direction. And we should emancipate in Europe when it comes to that.
And the one thing you would ask from the leaders to allow this sort of innovation and collaboration to exist and to thrive so that it achieves results, what is the one thing you would ask from large institutions, want to see from large institutions like WHO or government leaders, policy making?
If you take that Aminazé, duplication to the world through data, what we did, what governments did and institutions did, was creating the digital libraries. Like we have public libraries where you can go and read a book. Now, the digital libraries are owned or all stored in GitHub, which is a commercial platform owned by Microsoft and hosted in the US. What we need is digital libraries. We need places where in the digital copy of our world, we have free spaces where we can access the alphabet so we can learn others to use it and to write their own books. So I think if there's one thing that the World Health Organization can do is accelerate the growth of what we call digital commons, which is data sets that we need, not private data sets, not personalized data, but data sets that we need and the access to the tools, machine learning models, trained models, and the incentives to drive that. And the policy recommendation that I made of having a copyleft license for patient data. If we have that, we have the solution.
Thank you so much, Bart, and thank you for letting me pick your brain a little at the end there. I don't think you're expecting it.
No, it's fine.
So thank you very much, Bart de Witte from the
you.
Hippo AI Foundation for giving us that very inspirational keynote.